Today's topic and theme is really important to me around how to build world-class wellbeing strategies at enterprise level. It's a huge challenge supporting thousands of people's well-being. We're going to draw the line between paternalism and support. That's something that we're going to talk through today, all the way through to globalization, which is a huge challenge for many of our organizations, all the way then through to engagement, personalization, and even interventions that we can be looking at going forward. So a huge warm welcome to you on today's session. So there will be a recording for anyone that wants to watch it back or wants to share it with their team members. I always get loads of messages after this saying, I wish that my HR manager could have joined, or the CEO, for instance. So feel free to share this session with them. The more people that can see this and get the expertise from our three incredible panelists, which I'll introduce shortly, the better within here as well. If there are any questions that you've got, please ask them in the chat feature. That's exactly why we're doing today's session, is because we've listened to you and people like you that want to be able to be supported in building enterprise level wellbeing sessions. So if there's anything specific that you'd like to cover, then please do either pop it to me individually or pop it to the group, and we'll be able to get round to that today. Now, where I wanted to start today is with a personal story, and next Monday marks World Mental Health Day. And it's an incredible day and event to be able to raise awareness around mental health within the workplace. But what we know is that we all have mental health all of the time, and it's something that we want to be talking about and shouting about from the rooftops across the whole year. But I'm going to share with you my personal story when it comes to well-being. So this is James. James was my mentor 4.5 years ago, and was one of the youngest directors on the FTSE 100, heading up a global organization with tens of thousands of people. And I was extremely lucky to work closely alongside James. And you know those people that invest time into you that don't have the time, and I'm sure everyone on this call has those people. That was James to me. Now, the reason why I share with you this story ahead of World Mental Health Day is that James lived with positive mental well-being throughout his lifetime. He had an incredible wife and 2 children that I got to know really well. He built a strong community around him. He was the life and soul of the party. And tragically, 4 years ago, almost to this day, my friend and mentor experienced a 2-week bout of stress and ended up taking his own life. So this is the fire in our belly at Champion Health, is how do we support people like James whilst they're thriving and whilst they're well, and how do we support people like James that may be struggling? And that's going to be a key theme today of how we can bring things together, how we can proactively support people, but then how we can get early intervention into our organizations to prevent things like this from occurring in the future. Now, one thing I did want to mention as well is peer support is absolutely vital when it comes to this topic, and sharing learnings and best practice with other global leaders. And at Champion, we created a Slack community with over 50 global leaders from, I think, everyone in this session, actually, Andy, Artie, and Zoe. We've got the likes of the head of wellbeing at Rolls-Royce there as well. So if you'd like to join this Slack community, then please just say yes, please, and we can add you to it off the back of this session, or ping me an email and we can pop you in there. There are no sales pitches within there. It's just one place that we can share best practice and learn from each other going forwards. So on to today's panelists. These are a few of the brands that you might be familiar with, that they've worked within currently or previously and headed up wellbeing strategies for. So on to today's panelists. 2 of them are part of the Global Wellbeing Advisory Board that Champion Health have put together. The first one that I'd love to welcome is Artie, who's the Group Head of Wellbeing at Ocado. I'm going to get Artie to share a bit more around her background, because it's a really unique journey into wellbeing, having worked for Deloitte previously. The next person that I'd love to welcome is Zoe Eccleston. Zoe's a global leader when it comes to workplace health and has consulted organizations such as Bloomberg, Vodafone, all the way through to PepsiCo as well. So in pretty good hands with Zoe today. And the final person is a colleague and a friend, Andy Holmes, client partner at Corn Ferry, former global head of wellbeing at Reckitt as well, heading up the wellbeing program for tens of thousands of people. So we're in a great position today to answer all of your questions, all of your challenges, to make sure the next 55 minutes, or 53 minutes, I should say, is really powerful, engaging, and useful for you going forwards. So where I'm going to go now is stop sharing my screen. And Andy, I'm going to kick off with you. I'm going to throw a tough question, a broad question to you, of what are the challenges that enterprise level organizations are facing from the work that you're doing at Corn Ferry at the moment?
So first of all, I've got to take my hat off to you, Harry. I mean, listen to you sort of tell your story, you know, keeping your composure. I know how much it means to you, and, you know, thank you for sharing it with us. You know, just to echo what you said, I think, you know, next week is a key point in the calendar. But, you know, for me, it also makes me sad that there's so much effort on one day, and it's got to be about sustainability. And I guess that takes us into one of the challenges around well-being from an enterprise perspective, is that, you know, quite often well-being is a trigger, or it's initiated from a need to react to an acute status or an acute series of events.
Yeah.
And I think so as a result of that, quite often the initiatives, the focus are around fixing a problem. For me, I think the opportunity is around how do you shape a future? So instead of looking backwards and continuously trying to fix what's already gone, how do you actually start to look forwards? We've all done prioritization matrices where you look at impact versus you know, effort, or impact versus ease of implementation. And if you're always stuck in the bottom left dealing with the acute, you never actually get to a place where you actually shift anything. You're just reacting to the symptoms of things. So that's probably the biggest thing for me is, you know, organizations who are trying to react to something acute to fix a problem, but in doing so, never manage to create the space or the time or the focus or the engagement to actually start to move towards a direction, which is ultimately going to be the fundamental change that's going to improve the experience for everyone concerned.
And it's a really powerful message, and I'm going to unpick that to the nth degree throughout today's session. But Artie, I'd love to ask exactly the same question to you. What are the challenges you're facing? And I know you're very well networked and connected within the wellbeing space, and other organisations may be facing as well.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely would piggyback on what Andy said, but I think there's this overall element that typically when we look at well-being, it tends to be an add-on, or feels sometimes like an add-on, right? It's like what Andy said around World Mental Health Day, right? It's like a reactionary thing, like it's a point in time that we have to call out and do something. And then we start to look at, like, what are the ways we respond? Okay, well, we have some better benefits, or we have some champions, or we have some training, and it becomes very much around this sense of just reacting and not really looking at the bigger challenge, right? And I think in my experience, like in my background, coming at it from where I have, when I started doing the role that I do now at Deloitte, I very much looked at it like someone that was a management consultant that was going out and doing the work. And so for me, it was sort of like, well, if we're going to actually have to address this concept or this idea of enterprise well-being, we're going to have to look at what does the day job actually look like? And what are those points or challenges that are baked into that are impacting people, right? That are causing stress, that are causing burnout, that are causing other ailments that are kind of surrounding that, and or creating this sense of that your job just isn't good for you, right? There's Business in the Community has done such a great report on this concept of, like, how can we make our jobs better for ourselves? And it really is that concept of trying to step back and look at it holistically. But then again, that does also make it more complex, because you have to look at, you know, the ways that we recruit, the ways that we interact with our clients, if you're in a client servicing role, the way that we work in a day-to-day in terms of our work location and office location. And there's just a lot of those things that you then have to wrap around that and think about.
Fantastic. And I think you bring such a fresh approach towards the wellbeing space, Artie, with the experience working at Deloitte as a consultant. You've been there and done it, and now the expertise that you can translate to Ocado, and we're going to explore that further. And Alex, you must apply for Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, because fastest finger first, already published the BITC Business in the Community report that Artie referenced as well. So thank you for that. And Zoe, I'm going to pass through to yourself now as well. What a background you've got. I think you've won that award today of the best background. What are the challenges that you're seeing in the space at the moment? And you must have seen a huge transition across the last 5, 10, 15 years in the wellbeing space too.
Yeah, well, I think I'm going to build on what Andy and Artie said. I think one of the important things is, for me, there have been some changes, but I think Artie picked up on a really an important point in the fact that we've got to get to a place, and he also caveated that we need to prioritize our goals. We all do all of the working out before the strategy, but we shouldn't be reactive. We know this is going to happen. Well-being is really important on a day-to-day business. So you're very polite of saying over the 15 years. So I've been doing this for 25 years, and it hasn't changed in 25 years. And when we're calling out mentors, you know, one of the person I really looked up to in the early days of Wellbeing, Dame Carol Black, and lots of us will have read her reports. And she used to say good work was good for us. And I think at the point where we are at today, going into Mental Health Day on Sunday, I think it doesn't matter to me whether I've worked for the big organizations like Pepsi, Vodafone, Bloomberg, or the smaller organizations. It doesn't matter. I've seen some amazing things done in small organizations. And the first key thing that I would say around this, and how I think successful companies have started, of when they have prioritized, when they know what they want in their strategy. And it's terribly easy to say that, but knowing what you want to do and not going after everything remains one of my key things I say anybody, big or small. There's so much put in the wellbeing business now. You know, there's so much that's supposed to be included. It's really difficult to know where to start and therefore what you're going to include.
And I'd love to unpack 3 things from that shortly. I'm going to pass over to Andy around cadence, because that's a theme that ties into your initial point, but around data, first of all, and where we can get that data from, Zoe, where we can start, and then also evidencing the impact ongoing of interventions and solutions. And we know there are 500,000 health apps on the App Store now. There are more than there are more wellbeing providers out there. We're one of them. Yet wellbeing is worsening within organisations. So there's a review that we all need to do around what's effective, what do we need to actually implement within our organisations. That's something we're going to discuss today. But Andy, we've spoken at long length around cadence, around especially our working lives. Can you just explain a little bit more around that and the work that you're doing with Corn Ferry specifically?
Yeah, so, no, absolutely. And it's, you know, I think just to, you know, just to echo Zoe's point, I think there's an awful lot of effort going into wellbeing, but I don't think we're making big strides in the right spaces. You know, I think just one thing I wrote down as Zoe was talking was that I think the way that organizations were structured and the operating models have been developed were based on what was best to drive efficiency and productivity in the business.
Yeah.
And it was based on the knowledge we had of ourselves as humans at that time, which meant the business dominated. I think where we're getting to now is that we know an awful lot more about what humans need, where we thrive, where we don't, what compromises us, what emotionally suppresses us, et cetera, and the challenge is that in order to really drive a shift, that knowledge now needs to start to challenge the operating models. Yeah. It can't just accommodate them, which I think is where we're at and why we've got this sort of real tension. So in terms of cadence, one of the things that you know, I've paid a lot of attention to, I've, you know, ex-professional sportsman, and a background in kind of physiology. So my knowledge and my thinking has always been about what is our body doing, reacting to, telling us about how we're responding to the environments we operate in. And one of the things that definitely doesn't work with us when we talk about cadence or rhythm is our day-to-day rhythm, but then also our seasonal or our annual rhythms as well. So the work that I'm starting to pay a lot more attention to is, in order to build capacity in people to be well, to feel better, to do more, to lean in more, and to thrive in doing so, we need individuals to be able to muster more capacity. You know, if you shrink your capacity, you have less space to deal with the bumps that every day will throw at you. If we take, I suppose, on a micro level first, in our daily capacity, at the moment, one of the things we don't do is pay any attention to our own personal rhythms. So if I want some time with you, I look at Harry's calendar and I book a slot when Harry has a gap. Now that pays no attention to what you're fit for, what your energy levels are like, what I need from you, and how we actually start to make that time sync together. So that's one of the pieces. We all have a rhythm in terms of energy, focus, everything else. Then if you look at that and you say, what about over a quarter, over a year, and you look at the organizational cadence, everyone on this chat will have periods in the year where, you know, you've got 3 or 4 initiatives that might bump up together. It might be financial planning, it might be pay review, it might be you know, sort of succession planning, it might be customer reviews. But we tend to get these and they compound on each other, and we get these massive ramp ups in terms of stress, workload, you know, sort of less time with our families, and it really compromises us human beings. But we're failing to take the step back and identify what are the metrics and the measures, what's the data telling us, when do we get attrition, not just what is our attrition. When we get attrition, is that associated with certain times of the year? What's happening day to day within that? How do we start to recadence the organization so that we flatten the peaks and we extend the impulses? so that we actually allow people to oscillate. We are built as human beings to oscillate in stress.
Yeah.
Stress is good for us. Eustress is good for us. De-stress is not. We're spending most of our lives in de-stress. So how do we start to re-space or re-cadence what we do in sync with our organizations?
Yeah, I think it's a really powerful message. And I've been speaking to people around emotional regulation as well, and making sure that we're flattening the peaks and the highs, and also we're heightening the lows, and so we can regulate ourselves over a period of time, because there are highs and lows within any organization, whether it's my partner working for the NHS or whether it's myself working at Champion, and that emotional regulation really ties into that. And I think all of those areas of cadence, I've learned so much from you, Andy, so I want to say thank you there. We've got our first question from Chris, and that's come through the Q&A feature. If anyone wants to their name not to be mentioned, just put brackets anon at the end. So keep them coming through. And Artie, I'm going to forward this to you if that's okay.
Oh, yeah.
So Chris has asked, do you see wellbeing more as a genuine responsibility of an organisation or a strategic competitive advantage in retaining and getting the best out of our people? Big question. Artie, I'll pass over to you.
Yeah, I actually think it's both. And that I know that totally is a cop-out because it doesn't necessarily answer the question. But the reality, there's two things, right? So I think at the heart of it, we have to step back and say what are businesses. Businesses are profit generating organizations. They play a place in our economic environment and in the world. They help the economy grow and continue to, thrive, and sometimes not. But they are a massive ploy in that, right? So I think when they look at things like well-being, like inclusion, like sustainability, all these sort of responsible business elements, there's a piece around, they have to look at it from what's the business advantage. So one side is how do I lean in and get and attract the right talent, and become or be seen as competitive in the marketplace. I mean, that it is a strategic enabler, right? And you're seeing that now with, more of the millennials and Gen Zs and what they crave in terms of the organizations they work for. They want organizations that are focusing on these topics. So it's in their interest to do that because that's how they're going to retain and attract the best talent and therefore then continue to thrive as an organization. Yeah. I think on the flip side of it, it is that by the sheer size and impact and volume of an organization, they have this responsible place to play in the grander scheme of things. And it's then therefore, how do they use that level of impact to better support the environment around them and also their employees. And so I think there's that sense of they are responsible and accountable. And I think things like COVID obviously has heightened all of that. You're starting to see that you just don't employ people that come through the door. Like when we spend a third of our lives working, when people come through the door, they don't check the things that are happening in their outside life. They bring those to work. It's really hard to compartmentalize. Mm-hmm. And so we have to think about that whole person approach and therefore then, support our people because they are key enablers to helping businesses thrive. Yeah. So, I mean, again, I didn't really pick one side or the other. I totally give the political answer, but I truly believe it is both.
And I'd echo exactly that as well. And doing things right by the people and right by our customers is right by the business. One example of this was we launched Friends and Family at Champion Health, whereby every single member that has access to Champion in an organisation that's funded it can share the platform with 3 friends and family members. And on the face of it, we've lost money off the back of that. But actually what it's done is grown the brand. More organisations now than ever are more interested in Champion because we're able to extend our impact. So same with wellbeing in that arena as well. And one thing I wanted to pick up on, Artie, was around the whole person approach. That's a big challenge for organisations because there are so many areas of wellbeing, from financial wellbeing that I know you're a huge advocate around, through to mental wellbeing, sleep, parenting, all the way through to the performance and productivity angle. How do we as wellbeing leads, and another many wellbeing leads or chief people officers, support the whole person when there is so much to consider within there?
I think it's about saying that like you can't acknowledge and understand all the permutations that are possible. I mean, me and you could be staying next to each other and literally have the exact, feel like on the outside, we have the exact same experiences and we're going through the same things. Yeah. But even in that, there's going to be loads of intersectionality. And I think it's that sense of understanding that we're never going to be able to solve every single challenge. Yeah. And therefore, then the best way to do it is how do we enable personalization or choice and flexibility? And it's not then thinking, and this totally doesn't help organizations like Champion in some ways, but it's almost like the sense of is the better thing to do to give people that flexibility, autonomy, and choice by giving them a portion of spend that they can choose to use however they want for their well-being, because they know themselves best. In that can be a suite of products that they can pick from, but it's understanding all those things. It's also then understanding the demographics of the organization and saying, right, Kate, if you have all your diversity data, you can kind of pinpoint and understand where people are and what you might need to target. And it's going after the things that, you know, are high priority for you as an organization, and or looking at the majority and saying, like, look, I can't get to everyone, but this is the majority that I'm going to focus on, and this is why, and sort of have that business case element to it. And that's something I'd love to pass through to yourself. So in building that business case, you mentioned knowing where to start, and I think a lot of organizations are reevaluating their wellbeing program at the moment ahead of the next financial year and where to invest. Where would you encourage organizations to look at to begin with?
I think you touched on it. It's got to be the data. So I think exactly what Archie said, you know, it's really going to be difficult to do all things to all people. But one of the things I think we often fail to mention is the importance of breaking teams down. So however big your global organization is, we should still remember that there are small business units, and it's important for those small business units to remain in touch with each other. And I think that that's where I've seen the biggest success in the organizations that I've seen, is when the managers actually know their team, because there is some ability to then personalize what is needed within that team and support each other that can then grow out. And I think that there's, with the danger of hybrid working, quite a lot of the information that's talked about at the moment is how actually those one-to-ones, the team meetings are becoming more and more dispersed. People go, oh, you don't really need that. You're not coming into the office. And what used to be an hour team meeting just kind of happens, you know, ad hoc. And I think we have to remember that that's really important, because that's where you get some of your data from. So some data can be collected brilliantly through, you know, Champion Health, different ways, but also some data is actually just that one-to-one data that you're absorbing and getting, and that's really important. And it varies so much between organization, the size of the organization, the location of that organization, and as Andy was saying, where you are in a cadence with that organization. If you're a startup, you're going to have very different energies than if you're a huge global organization, and therefore it needs to be different. And I think with so much information in the you know, out there now in the media, you need to be really careful to personalize to your organization and not just think, oh my goodness, they're doing this, we should be looking at that. Have you got any evidence that that is actually what's going to be required? So I started by saying, set your own specific goals, use the data that you have got yourself and you can collect much more easily. Be specific as to what data you're collecting, otherwise you're just going to get so much data you're not going to know what to do with it, and start from there. So start small, know where you're going, and build up. And I think there's been a challenge that providers have really led organizations to investing in things before the organization saying this is what we need to do, and then we're going to find the provider to fit that specific area. And we've got a question, Zoe, that I'd like to pass back to you actually, from Rupinder. Where should a wellbeing strategy sit within an organization? Big question, Rupinder. I've got my own specific thoughts, but it could be the operations team, it could be the CEO, it could be the HR team, it could be the wellbeing team, it could be the Occ Health team, it could be the health and safety team. And I've ignored a lot of other areas from reward and benefits, for example. Where does it sit, Zoe? Well, you haven't mentioned the one that I think is the best place for it to sit. So I've sat in all of the organizations that I've worked with in different ones, even in property ones. But the best place that I think the best ability to communicate was in the communications team. So when I sat in the communications teams, that was where I knew how to use the channels best. And we always have, on all of these calls that we join with each other, is always like, we have to communicate, we have to communicate. So if you could get your health and wellbeing team to have a really strong lead, and when I worked at RWE, I was within a huge comms team, and I found it the best. I could write blogs, I could do vlogs. This was way before lots of apps existed, and I did find, and I look back to those days and think, whenever I join a new organization, the first person I really need to link in with is the comms team, because it doesn't matter how good you are, if you don't get the data in and you don't get the information out, your strategy is not going to have anywhere to go. So that would be my go-to place. And that's something I want to pick up on further. There's a question from Fatima that I'm going to pass through to Andy in a moment, but around communication and how to reach people. And Artie, would love to get your thoughts on that too.
So Fatima's asked, very insightful discussion. So thank you, first of all. How can a mid-sized organisation, HR, prioritise employee wellbeing whilst also working in a fast-paced, global-oriented environment where teams are micromanaged? So Andy, I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
I think this question actually ties quite nicely back to the previous one. I think, and this, Fatima, I think the question you pose is not just mid-sized organizations. There's a lot of huge global organizations that are having exactly the same thing. And I think for me, that is where part of the problem comes from. Typically in that sort of organization, HR are, if they're trying to manage or mitigate what's already happening in the business, in the functions, I think that's probably the wrong place to start with where wellbeing should be coming from. I'm a huge advocate of the fact that wellbeing needs to be integrated into the operating model, the behaviors, the cadence, everything else within an organization. Otherwise, it becomes a bolt-on, which I think, Artie, you mentioned right at the start, which it absolutely can't be. So I would be looking at that, and even just the words you used, micromanagement. And I'm a big sort of believer in trying to reframe what wellbeing is all about. If people are micromanaging, then for me, what that says is that people are feeling threatened. People are feeling a sense of potential exposure, and people are feeling the need to protect themselves. Now, that might be just reporting, but the flip side is that is from an emotional, from a human, from a well-being point of view, people are feeling a sense of threat, psychological safety. In that organization, I'll be starting to ask questions about what is psychological safety? What are our engagement scores like? What's our collaboration and inclusion metrics look like? Are people overusing drive behaviors, underusing EQ behaviors? Because it's not about prioritizing well-being. For me, that's too broad. It's back to what Zoe was saying about the data. Look at the various data sets you've got to give you the picture of actually what's going on.
Yeah.
If what's going on is that people feel threatened, the business is underperforming, people are tense, people are insular, then well-being isn't really, holistically is not going to be the solution. I'd be much more diving into, right, what's happening in pockets, in teams? How do you help leaders and managers to understand that in trying to drive the business, they're creating an environment that constricts and conflicts and undermines people?
Yeah.
And in doing that, the business isn't going to drive. So how do you start to make well-being part of the performance conversation, not just a bolt-on to accommodate the symptoms of driving for performance?
I think that's a really important theme, Andy, and around psychological safety too. It's many of us will be aware of the project Aristotle run by Google, whereby they looked at what the common themes and traits were within the highest performing teams, and the common theme was there was psychological safety within there. And so that's something that Alex may be able to link out to, and we've done previous sessions on that topic too. So I hope that will help going forward, Fatima, because that is always a challenge of a fast-paced organisation. Does it come at the cost of that? I would say the fast-paced organisations need that more than any organisation going forwards. Artie, there's been a lot spoken around communications, and you're heading up the wellbeing strategy at Ocado. So tens of thousands of people, many of them classified potentially as hard to reach, whether we like that term or not. How do you go about the communication strategy? How closely do you work with the comms teams? And are there specific ways of reaching that population that other people may not have considered?
Like you were when I was working late last night, exactly what I was doing, writing about thousands of comms. Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because you can't use as a blanket approach. You need to, I think at the heart of everything that we do from a wellbeing perspective is you need to understand the employee experience. And understanding the employee experience means breaking it down in terms of all the different types of employees and what that experience looks like. Therefore, then you understand how and when they touch things that you could perhaps communicate on.
Yeah.
So like in a logistics environment, they are never going to open a company newsletter. Half of them don't even have a company email address. What they will respond to is if you put up a banner in their cafe and offer some freebies, they'll come talk to you and they'll get to hear it, right? They might check out the screens that are in the cafe. They might check out screens that are in and around the work area, but they are never really going to integrate with that. What they will do is they'll talk to their managers on site. They'll, you have to think about how do I get and penetrate those people by understanding, what is their pattern. And then the other aspect is looking at all the other different demographics. So for us, it's like the logistics environment, plus we have tech people, but it's what are all the different platforms? How can I get creative about it? And then how can I also then form the messaging so that the messaging speaks to them? So again, in the logistics environment, you're probably not using loads of corporate talk. They probably don't care if, you know, the CFO or the CEO has sent a message. But in, you know, in the broader, more corporate environment, they love like a really responsible message from like a C-suite executive, right? So it's, again, it's just understanding and knowing that you're going to have to flex the approach, and it's not going to be, I have one comms, I'm just going to put it on all the channels and that's it.
And I'm a huge believer. I was talking to a global head of wellbeing as part of our advisory board as well, Jamie Broadley, and he was asking more questions around marketing, because that's something I think so many wellbeing leads could learn, is how to reach people with the communications, how to make it relatable. And something you touched upon there, Artie, was not everyone would respond to the C-suite necessarily. I've been thinking about this recently and speaking to some of my friends that have had messages from the C-suite saying, times are really hard with the cost of living at the moment, and they're turning around going, well, you're on £500,000 a year. It's slightly different for you versus me that's on £25,000 a year living in London, X, Y, and Z. How do you get around those communication challenges? And is that something you've done where it's more relatable, especially to the boots on the ground and maybe the fleet-based workforce that you have?
Yeah, I think it's also just, you have to understand the tone, right? So in that environment, it sounds so condescending for, again, like, in our case, a CEO to send an email to someone who's like an hourly paid workforce in the logistics environment and say that. They don't understand. They come from completely different places. But how can you build that level of empathy and compassion into that and not draw the comparison of, I also feel you, because what you feel is completely different from what I feel, right? Like, I'm wondering if I can pay my rent. You're just like, maybe I should cut out a massage. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's so different. So there's this sense of, you know, understanding, going back to understanding your audience, understanding your customer, and how do you draw that level of empathy in. And to be fair, the comms teams, they should know that. Like, if I give an example at Ocado, obviously with World Mental Health Day, there's lots of stuff happening next week. And we are also going through a transformation as a business. It's and we're dealing with things like cost of living crisis, still impacts from the war on Ukraine. Like, there's lots of different factors. But then how do we not just like have a message that negates all of that, right? How do we connect all those pieces together and make it seem like, you know, we understand all these things that people are dealing with, and therefore these are why we're doing some of these things. And I think it's that bringing it all together, right? Telling that story. Yeah.
So much to unpack within that. And I'm going to go through to a question from Pippa within the Q&A. Then I'll go through to Scott. And we've got Fatima, a question from yourself as well. But it's amazing to see so much engagement, first of all, with today's conversation. I'm sure so much of this we could pick up again on Slack for those people that want to join that community and learn from the best and share best practice too. Zoe, I'm going to forward this to you if that's okay. Challenging question, one that I don't think any organisation has absolutely nailed, because it is such a challenging topic with cultural nuance. But Pippa has asked around how global organisations can best address the cultural differences across various regions when building a wellbeing strategy. So APAC versus UK versus Latin America, for example. I'm conscious that all of us are based within Western society, for example, so certain biases, big cultural nuances with the Middle East compared to the UK, for example, with mental health. How can we go about that within our global wellbeing strategies?
I think it's the same approach as we've already been talking about. It's sort of dividing out what's important where and making sure you are inclusive, but you also have a diverse strategy, because there are such differences. And, you know, when I worked at Bloomberg, I had to look after 62 offices in 31 countries. And we could have some things that were across the whole patch, but some things had to be very specific for the area that they were in. And I was only looking after, EMEA. So we also had Asia, we had Americas. And I think, so some things we had leaders in each part that we agreed which was going to be across the whole business, and other bits that had to be local. And I think that's good. And I think it has some, that's important, because it then makes it look more authentic, because you are doing it for the right reasons, not just because we're just doing one size fits all. So knowing what the boundaries are in each area, what actually is acceptable, what isn't, where the issues are. So it doesn't change. It's knowing the audience. The answers I feel I keep giving are know your audience, get the data and have a look at it. And don't feel that you've just got to whitewash everybody with the same, because someone will put their hand up and say, why don't we have that? And if you go, oh, okay, well, we've already got that over here. It's quite easy to transpose it if it's already up and working and it's wanted. But what's more importantly is to make sure you're not missing something or applying something that isn't actually appropriate in that area. So that would be my answer.
And that's something that I've seen a shift, and Artie, I'd love to come to you in a second, around organisations taking this global approach and everything now being centralised. And I think it might go full circle at some stage, or even have a blend of both, whereby it might be centralised to a certain extent with certain initiatives, but without a shadow of a doubt, you need that localised element. And the boots on the ground in that country, being able to shape the strategy around that. Artie, would love to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, sorry, I was just like, I must add something. And I think the importance behind the intersectionality, that raises a really big importance around the intersectionality with inclusion, and that sense of how closely are you working with your diversity and inclusion teams to understand those cultural nuances. And the other thing is, we often talk about cultural nuances by stepping back and looking at regions of the world and where we live. But those cultural nuances exist in all of our organizations, right? And it goes back to understanding your diversity data, your demographic data, understanding what that means for all of them. And that helps you translate. I mean, I also definitely take to your point, Harriet, on the fact that I think the center will have to own certain things and almost give the autonomy to the local regions to do that. But I think that intersectionality with inclusion is hugely important. We can't negate that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree any more with that. So really challenging topic, Pippa, but something that I know organisations are looking to split with a central team, but then also empowering the specific localised teams as well. We've just gone live with in a country whereby suicidal attempts are still illegal, for example. So you need a very different approach there than you do to the UK, even though the Northeast is very different to the Southeast, for example, in the UK. So there's a challenge there still. Andy, would love to pass over to you on Scott's question that was asked around 5 or 10 minutes ago. So thank you for your patience on that, Scott. And there has been a lot that's been mentioned around data-led initiatives and strategies, which is great. Scott's asked, however, what techniques have you used to correlate and analyse the various streams of data? Because as we've mentioned, too much data that doesn't link in together, that's a dangerous thing because we can't apply the action and insight. So how do we go about correlating, analysing that data to translate it into meaningful action and insight going forward?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I guess there's a few components to the answer from my perspective anyway. If we can just kind of take a step back, I think there's two things that I see as an interplay here that I've observed across, many industries and sectors. One is that very few organizations have a true and authentic vision of what their environment looks like when they get wellbeing right. So whether that's a statement, whether it's a proposition, whatever it might be, a lot of people have a strategy, but before a strategy, there has to be a vision and there has to be an alignment. It has to be authentic and congruent. So I think that's the first thing that I see is missing in a lot of cases. Obviously there's different conferences and things that we've all been part of, and people turn up and it's all about doing. What can I do? What can I put in place? What can I transpose, copy, lift and shift? Start with what your vision looks like. What are you trying to get to? Not what are you trying to fix necessarily. I think the other thing when it comes to data is that a lot of organizations are measuring things that the solutions they've bought tell them they can measure. So it might be that, I bought a platform that can measure, I don't know, staircases per day or something like that people walk up, and therefore I've got this data, so how do I analyze it? What do I do with it? So again, going back to the vision piece, are you sourcing the right solution based on your vision, and does that solution give you the data that helps you to measure your progress towards your vision? So I suppose that's a few steps back to the initial question. The other thing I would say is when you get to data, we are human beings. We are incredibly subjective. We just talked about cultural nuances, nuances in terms of geographic splits, socioeconomic, everything else. You can't just look at the hard data. So my urge to everyone will be is look at the qualitative side of the quant. What's the why behind the what? The what is what you're measuring. The why is what is it telling you and why does that matter? So from my experience, things like whether it's Glint, whether it's, all of the engagement surveys, the absolute figures will tell you the response to the question you've asked. The qualitative narrative that might sit in a sentiment analysis will tell you how people feel about the answers they've given. And that's often more important than the absolute data that you look at. I see a lot of organizations reacting, let's say, that they ask, how cared for you do you feel? Or what's your level of well-being? Or what's your level of engagement with the company? And we'll get a great score and everyone's high-fiving. The problem is that if you dig into the survey elsewhere, you will see that those very same employees are reporting back that you don't respect me as an individual and my work-life balance. I get no time with my family, et cetera, et cetera. So the big thing I would say is there's one way you can go, just how do I analyze the hard data? The bigger encouragement I would give is, how do you balance your insights on the hard and the soft data? The soft data is sometimes equally, if not more powerful. So that would be my big urge.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of organizations, especially again, global organizations, having conversations with every individual, it's not possible necessarily, but the quantitative data can lead to those conversations, open them up. And that's where the focus groups, the semi-structured interviews, that qualitative analysis can really come into it to be able to provide context to that quantitative data. So I think that's a fantastic answer within there. Zoe, we've got one more question from Fatima before I go through to a few questions that were sent through before today on, can you advise on the best online resources for wellbeing strategies and gathering and analysing data? Would an in-house survey be a good place to start, or are there any other specific platforms? I'm going to stay quiet because I'm slightly biased, but I'm going to pass through to you on that one, Zoe.
Okay, well, obviously I will stay completely unbiased too, Harry. But I think a good question. I think it does, I don't know your organization, so that does depend. Obviously, we're all saying you need to know your organization, so it's quite difficult to send you anywhere, because I don't think there is a holy grail of the right place to go. I know Harry is trying really hard to get there and he's doing a great job. But as Andy just rightly said, I think often, to start with, a lot of the information that you need to look at to know where to go for the next bit of data is within your organization already. So you should be looking at your sickness and absence, your attrition rate. Occupational health data can tell you an awful lot about why your people are not at work or not doing their best at work. Hardly ever looked at. It's something like that, so old school nowadays. People just don't look at it, and I encourage organizations all the time to look at that data. And the other data that's not looked at is why people are leaving your business. If anyone that I know that's young is going for a job, they look at Glassdoor. Why do people not like to work at that business? So why are we waiting for people to leave for them to write it externally? Why aren't we having those conversations internally? And if we are having them internally as their exit interviews with HR, why are we not looking at that stuff? Because that will give you the answer to then where to go out online to do a survey as to what you're wanting to achieve. So that would be my overview.
Thank you, Zoe. And again, a fantastic overview. And Sands, great to see you, Dr. Sands, as well. She's mentioned, I think the language of hard and soft data is tricky. It's quite similar with soft skills as well. And Andy's answered a fantastic answer of qualitative and anecdotal, because soft does make it sound less important without a shadow of a doubt. What I'd love to do in the next 10 minutes, I'm conscious that in the UK, bellies might be rumbling. So you've got lunchtime coming up. In Melbourne, there might be a few tired eyes and yawns as well. So we'll make sure that we give you 5 minutes back on today's schedule so you can get outside, get some vitamin D, because the sun's shining up north, which it rarely does up here. So what I'd love to do in the next 10 minutes with our three incredible panelists today is just shape what you think the future of wellbeing looks like. Very big question that we started with, very big question that we'll end with as well. So Artie, I'd love to get your thoughts on what the future of wellbeing looks like, what the next few years look like at Ocado, for example.
It's interesting because I was asked this question this week at another event around in 3 years' time, if we had a magic wand, what would it look like? I'd say I'll answer that secondly, but the first part, I guess the future of wellbeing for Ocado, we are on a journey. We are also going down the path of intersectionality. So I am starting a new job as of Monday. So Hot Press is where I'm going to be looking after both well-being and inclusion. And so I think the future of well-being for Ocado is really about that intersectionality between the two and telling a more holistic story by really understanding our people. We've spent, my role was new 18 months ago. So the last 18 months have really been about getting some strong foundations in, which I think we will have by the end of this financial year. And so it's really then understanding that in the context of our changing business environment. So that's the future. I think if I answer the question of, what do I hope the future of workplace well-being looks like in 3 to 5 years, really controversial response, but I feel like roles like ours shouldn't exist. Because if we talk about all the things that we've talked about at the beginning, which is around this sense of it should be baked in, it should feel, you should go into work and it should look and feel like something that's integrated into what you do, then you shouldn't have to have someone that's telling you what you need to be doing. It should be baked into the corporate strategy and into what the organizational sense of responsibility is.
And I can see that shift already happening within organizations that have got elements right. That it's shifting towards culture and head of culture rather than the head of well-being, and well-being sits within that arena. Just one thing I'd like to pick up on, Artie, that you mentioned, and I've got some insider information here, so I can ask this question. You mentioned setting the foundation, and there's a big movement of mental health first aid. There's been a big movement of training line managers, and line managers are being squeezed bottom down, bottom up, top down, just everywhere, side to side. You're looking to empower every individual of understanding the basics around mental health. Can you just talk a little bit more around that?
Yeah, and interestingly enough, I was chatting to someone this week around, they're writing an article right now for Harvard Business Review on, are managers meant to be therapists? And it's supposed to be the title on it. And I guess it's very true. We are squeezing managers by giving them so much responsibility. What we're not doing is giving them a space to actually test out what they need to be doing. We're not giving them the space to learn. We're not helping them with their workload. And so what's then happening is you're throwing all this responsibility on them. You're also asking them to role model behaviors, but they are drowning. And so are they beacons and role models of good well-being in the workplace? Probably not. And so therefore then that transpires into the cultures they create, because as much as they want to try to be there, they can't. And the thing that I always stand on is, in an organization, the minute we start to put so much more accountability and responsibility on leaders and managers, which I definitely agree there should be some, is you create this framework where it's sort of parent-child, right? So managers and leaders are big, scary parents, and everyone else is a child. And so therefore you create this mentality where you're almost already inherently removing the psychological safety. The reality is we're all adults operating in a virtual or physical environment. And so as adults, we all have a certain level of accountability to ourselves and to those around us. And so the approach that we're taking is to design a foundations course for everyone in the business, so that everyone can be on the same equal footing to understand what mental health means for them individually, how it could show up in the workplace, and how they then take that on. And then we can look at, okay, is there a nuance by adding a separate module for managers or leaders or other, other slices of people in your organization? But the base foundation is, can we just bring everyone up to the same level playing field and say that we all have a part to play? At Ocado, one of our key values is in it together, and it really resonates because it's that sense of we do all have a responsibility in what we're trying to do and achieve.
And I think just echoing that as well, when I shared my story around James, and when I spoke to someone within that organization, they were a receptionist that spotted the warning signs and didn't know what to do and what to say, and they hadn't had any base level training, and who knows what could have happened if they had the confidence and the basic level skills of how to have that conversation, how to signpost and where to as well. So I want to say a massive thank you for you doing that in Ocado, first of all. So we would love to get your thoughts on what the future of wellbeing looks like from you. You've seen big change over a period of time, and what change can you see occurring going forwards?
Well, obviously, I'd like to endorse what Artie said. I think it is really important that it does have to become everybody's responsibility. And echoing what you've just said around, who's going to recognize the signs. So we do all need a base level of training and recognizing, because we're not going to know who's going to be in the right place at the right time. One of the things, I remember when they, said it's good to talk, but I think one of the things I would really like people to say is also good to listen. because I think people are saying things and we're not necessarily hearing them. So, you know, we've all had that situation, and some people, we're all very different, will call out for help in different ways. So we've all said a lot, there needs to be more one-to-one time, or just being with your colleagues. It doesn't matter whether it's a manager or somebody else. Someone might just recognize that they've seen that or heard a problem, and then be brave to listen, but then to know how to approach, like Artie was saying, and then know what to do with it. So I think that's really important. So I think that picks up on a point, the word Andy used, which is the being authentic. And so I've always, anybody that knows me will always say that I think culture is king. So it doesn't matter where you work, the size of your organization, culture is king. It would be great if I've always said, Artie, that I think we all should be aiming to make ourselves redundant. That was a line I've always used in the organizations. If I've done my job, I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't be here needing to keep twisting the same things all the time. So that's really good. So we've got to have a good culture. And a good culture will be when the employees believe that it's an authentic culture and that what we're putting in is for the right reasons. And I like to think that over the next 3 to 5 years, we might be able to start to go in that direction. But one thing I think, a big shift that I think will also come in, and hasn't been mentioned on today's call and will be another big subject for a conversation, is that we talk about health and well-being. It was always called health and well-being, and we talk about well-being now. We talk about mental health a lot, but there is no mental health without physical health. And so again, another thing that I bang the drum a lot about is physical health. So I do see a lot of organizations being very concerned around the training and the resilience training, but actually there needs to be a lot. You started the conversation with Andy about how's his cycling. I'm sure he'll tell you that's great for his mental health. And I really would like to see us being able to do a lot more around physical health in the next 3 to 5 years, because I think that will, you know, nicest guideline, the first thing you should do for someone with a mental health problem is physical exercise. So I think that would be like, maybe it's a hope of mine, but maybe my hope will, you know, move into actually some change that we do need to see.
Yeah, and there's recent research as well that's demonstrated that for moderate depressive symptoms, that physical activity is just as effective as antidepressant medication. And that's not one or the other. Both of those can be very powerful going forward. So I completely echo what you mentioned there, Zoe. And Andy, would love to get your thoughts as well, to finish on an inspirational tone so everyone can eat their lunch with excitement, or go to
I mean, thank you. I mean, I'm inspired because what I've heard from Artie and Zoe is in 3 years' time, I can retire. So that sounds amazing. So thank you for that. But no, seriously, just to pick up on a few points, I think for me, if I fast forward 3 years' time, I don't believe that well-being should be the focus. My big push, and you mentioned cadence, but my big word and everything that I'm going to be focused on at Korn Ferry is capacity. And the reason for that is that, you know, if we actually take a step back from all of this, the thing that human beings are best at doing is being human. The problem arises when we are in an environment where the capacity to be human is completely undermined. You know, we don't have the energy, the focus, the time, the space, the patience, all of these great things that, you know, if you think about when you go on holiday, you become a better human being. You become more present, more engaging, more balanced, all of these great things. So for me, it's not so much about how do we fix the problems of well-being, it's how do we create an environment where people are naturally well. So for me, you know, I think a few things to just sort of pick up on. Artie mentioned about the line manager training, completely agree, completely concur with that. I think as soon as you try and, you know, put responsibility onto one person, you create a bottleneck, you create a pressure point, you create a lack of access, and it's not necessarily something that people would choose themselves. I think when you look at how people want to service themselves, I think in corporate organizations, it's very easy to become obsessed with, we need to fix this in our organization. It's not about that anymore. It's about take a step back, look at the way that your people service themselves, access content, learn, engage, get support in their everyday lives, and embrace that. Bring the outside in. Don't try and convert them and force them to operate and behave in a way to service their own mental health that suits your organization. Embrace the way they would do it outside. I think tech is going to have a massive play in well-being. I don't think we're going to have, phones won't be such a big thing in a few years' time. I'm doing a lot of stuff with heart rate variability. How does that inform us about our underlying stress levels? How does that condition your behavior, your thoughts, your actions? I think that's going to become a lot bigger. I think, for me, again, it's about how do we start to embrace tech, start to understand human, take a bit of a reset and say, how do we get to a point where we are facilitating an environment where people have capacity to be awesome human beings? And I think we'll get to a point where we've got people forging ahead and we've got companies that will be lagging behind. I think the people who will be forging ahead will be the ones who recruit and have the great talent. I think the ones who lag behind will still be in the space that we're in right now, where they're trying to fix problems with attrition and acute symptoms. And I think, unfortunately, we're going to have to go through that pain split before we then start to come together after that. But for me, everything of the future is about how do we enable human capacity to be awesome at what we are, which is being human.
Thank you, Andy. So to wrap up today's session, so much to be able to take away, and we'd definitely run past 12 o'clock if I was to summarize everything that I've taken away from today. And I'm sure you all have as well. The chat again has been popping off, so sorry I couldn't get to some of the questions towards the end, but thank you all for your engagement. The second thank you I want to send is to Alex as well, who heads up all of this, does so much work behind the scenes as well. So a huge thank you to yourself, Alex. You don't get the praise that you necessarily deserve. And also to the three panelists today, Artie, Zoe and Andy. I know how busy you all are, spinning many plates and really championing this topic of well-being, performance and culture going forwards within organisations. Now, next Monday, as we started off by saying today, is World Mental Health Day. Let's make sure that we're having the conversation, we're championing mental health, not just then, but beyond then as well, into the future. Look forward to hearing from you and your thoughts. I read every single piece of feedback as well. So if you can share your thoughts, share your learning, share what you'd love to see in the next session, then we'll look to put something customized around that for you going forwards. Have a wonderful weekend when it arrives, and we will see you all soon. Take care. Thank you again to the panelists as well.